You ever notice something so strange, so obvious, that the world sees it every day, yet almost nobody dares to question it? Here is the glitch. Every country on Earth is drowning in debt, and somehow the world has not drowned. Japan owes trillions. Europe owes trillions. The United States owes more than any empire in human history. But here is the paradox they do not teach in school. If the entire planet is in debt, then who is the creditor? Who is everyone paying? That is the moment the story breaks. Because once you trace the chain all the way to its end, you do not find a superpower or a king or a megabank sitting on a golden throne. You find something much simpler and far more disturbing. Humanity owes itself, but the interest flows in only one direction. And that is not an accident. It is the design. Before this design existed, debt was simple. A king borrowed, a lender agreed. If the king defaulted, the lender lost money, the court cursed his name, and life moved on. Debt was temporary. It had a beginning and an end. Think of it like a bridge you build to cross a river once. You pay to build it, you cross, and eventually the bridge wears out. But by the late 1600s, England was collapsing. War with France, a navy to fund, an empire to protect. The treasury was empty. No one trusted the crown. The old bridge was gone, and the river was rising. Then a failed merchant named William Paterson walked into the crisis with an idea that sounded insane and brilliant at the same time. His thought was simple, dangerous, and completely new. Do not repay the principal. Pay interest forever. Instead of a bridge you build once and abandon, imagine a bridge where you pay rent every year just to keep walking across. The rent never ends. As long as you pay, you can cross. As soon as you stop, everything collapses. To run this new engine, Paterson helped create something that did not exist before. The Bank of England. Merchants deposited gold. The bank lent that gold to the government. The government paid interest with taxes collected from citizens. And the principal, the original pile of debt? It was never meant to be returned. The debt became permanent, a financial black hole that never stopped swallowing value. Every year, interest flowed from the public to the bank, from taxpayers to creditors, from the real economy into this new machine that never slept. But that was only the first step. Paterson added the mechanism that quietly changed civilization. Government debt would not just be a burden to be repaid someday. It would become the foundation of the money supply itself. Debt became money. Think about that for a second. If money is created from debt, then repaying debt destroys money. When the government issues bonds and the central bank buys them, it is not just borrowing. It is creating the very dollars people spend, save, and fight over. The implication is brutal. The system survives only if governments keep borrowing. Not for a year, not for a decade, forever. This was not a flaw in the system. It was the blueprint. The more the government borrowed, the more money existed. The more money existed, the more trade could happen, wars could be financed, roads could be built, empires could expand. On the surface, it looked like growth. Underneath, it was debt piling on top of debt. The machine worked so well that other nations copied it. Central banks spread. Government bonds became the backbone of national finances. And slowly, almost silently, the world moved from a system where money was based on metal to a system where money was based on promises. A century later, the stakes were higher. The world was industrializing. Railroads, factories, steamships, armies equipped with new technology. Nations did not just need money. They needed capital on a scale humanity had never seen. Enter Nathan Rothschild, a man who did not invent lending, but industrialized sovereign debt. He built what was effectively the first financial internet, a network stretching across 5 key cities: London, Paris, Frankfurt, Vienna, and Naples. Information moved faster than any government decree. Money moved faster than any army. His model was simple in concept: and revolutionary in practice. He bought government bonds wholesale and sold them retail. He turned static, illiquid promises into tradable assets. Now a banker in Paris could own British debt. An aristocrat in Germany could hold Austrian bonds. Capital flowed across borders, binding enemies and allies into the same web. When a government needed money, it no longer begged a handful of nobles. It tapped into a global market hungry for yield. Then came Waterloo, and with it, the story that still haunts financial history. Nathan Rothschild received news of Napoleon's defeat before almost anyone else. An information edge measured not in minutes, but in a full day, a lifetime in markets. According to the legend, he walked into the exchange and began selling British bonds aggressively. Traders panicked. They assumed Britain had lost. Prices collapsed. At rock bottom, he silently bought everything back. The next day, the official news arrived. Britain had won. Bond prices exploded upward. Rothschild, if the story is even half true, walked away with profit that would make a modern hedge fund blush. Whether the details are myth or reality is not the point. The architecture is what matters. Once sovereign debt became a global liquid market, default became more than a national problem. It became a systemic threat. If one significant country defaulted, investors in multiple nations would suffer. Banks would face losses. Governments would confront their own crises. The entire web shook. Suddenly, default was not just embarrassing, it was almost unthinkable. Governments did not keep paying out of honor. They kept paying because they had no choice. Too many people in too many places depended on those interest payments. By the early 1900s, the center of gravity shifted to America. The industrial boom created fortunes and fragilities. In 1907, the American financial system imploded. Banks failed. Markets froze. Panic spread like a virus. There was no central bank, no official lender of last resort. One man stepped into the vacuum, J.P. Morgan. He gathered bankers in his library, locked the doors, and forced them to agree on a private rescue plan. He used his own money and his own influence to stabilize the system. It worked, but it also exposed a terrifying truth. The entire financial architecture of the United States had been held together by one aging financier in one room. Elites drew the obvious conclusion: this could not happen again. The system needed a permanent buyer of government debt, a permanent emergency backstop, a permanent engine that could create money when no one else could. So in 1910, bankers and politicians met secretly on Jekyll Island to draft the blueprint for a new institution: the Federal Reserve. On paper, it looked public. In practice, it was designed to serve the interests of the banking system that helped create it. The Fed would sit in the background, anonymous to most citizens, but absolutely central to the operation of the debt machine. The Fed's power was deceptively simple. It could create money by buying government bonds. If the government needed cash, the Fed would step in, purchase its debt, and credit new dollars into the system. Demand for government bonds became effectively infinite because there was always one buyer who could not run out of money. Borrowing became limitless in principle. That is how a country can reach tens of trillions in outstanding debt and still have investors call its bonds safe. Think about what that means. Before the Fed, if the government borrowed too much, investors would eventually refuse to buy more bonds unless interest rates went through the roof. There was a natural ceiling. With the Fed, that ceiling turned into a skylight. If private demand fell, the central bank could simply step in and fill the gap. This did not remove consequences entirely. It just shifted them in time and spread them across the entire economy through inflation, asset bubbles, and distorted incentives. The moral hazard was enormous. Banks could take bigger risks, knowing that in a true crisis the central bank would provide liquidity. Governments could run larger deficits, confident that the Fed would not allow bond auctions to fail. Investors could gamble on ever more complex financial products. certain that their bets were implicitly backed by the same institution that kept government debt afloat. When the system stumbled, the Fed would do whatever it takes. In 2008, that meant trillions in emergency programs. In 2020, during the pandemic, it meant even more. By the 1980s, the machine had conquered the developed world, but faced a new kind of stress test. What happens when countries, especially poorer ones, simply cannot pay? The person who answered that question with brutal clarity was Paul Volcker, the tall, cigar-smoking chairman of the Federal Reserve. In the late 1970s, inflation in the United States was out of control. Prices rose at double-digit rates. Trust in the dollar was eroding. Volcker decided to break inflation the hard way. He raised interest rates to levels many people today cannot even imagine, near 20%. Inside the United States, this crushed borrowers, slowed the economy, and triggered a painful recession. But outside the United States, it was a financial earthquake. Many developing countries had borrowed in dollars at much lower rates. When Volcker slammed interest rates higher, their debt costs exploded. Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, and others suddenly owed far more in interest than their economies could generate. Default was not just likely, it was mathematically inevitable. Here is where the hidden architecture showed itself. If those countries defaulted, major American and European banks would face massive losses. Their balance sheets were loaded with loans to these nations. A wave of sovereign defaults would have triggered a banking crisis back in New York and London. So the system did what it always does. It refused to let default happen cleanly. Instead, the International Monetary Fund stepped in with rescue packages. New loans were offered to troubled countries, but not to liberate them from the trap. The purpose was to ensure they could keep paying interest to their existing creditors. The conditions attached to these loans were harsh: austerity, privatization, deregulation, and deep cuts in public spending. Governments were told to sell state assets/social programs and open their economies to foreign investors. Ordinary people lost jobs, subsidies, and safety nets. But the banks got paid. It was called stabilization, reform, and structural adjustment. In practice, it was a globalized debt trap. When you could not pay, you were not freed. Your chain was extended, your collar was tightened, your future was sold off in exchange for just enough cash to keep the interest flowing upward. At this point, the pattern is clear. With Paterson, debt became permanent. With Rothschild, debt became global. With Morgan and the Fed, debt became effectively infinite. With Volcker and the IMF, debt became inescapable, especially for poorer countries. Each step refined the same machine, making it stronger, more interconnected, and harder to escape. But to really see the design, you have to ask a simple question most people never think about. If debt is everywhere, and everyone seems to owe everyone else, why cannot the world just decide to pay it off and be done with it? The answer is uncomfortable. Paying off the debt would destroy the money that was created from that debt. In modern economies, government bonds sit at the core of the financial system. They are held by central banks, commercial banks, pension funds, insurance companies, and mutual funds. Those bonds are not just investments. They are collateral. They are the backbone of global liquidity. When a central bank holds a bond and the government pays it off, that bond disappears from the balance sheet. The money that was created when it was issued has to be pulled back out of the system. If the United States somehow decided to eliminate its entire national debt, something politicians occasionally promise in speeches, the result would not be a debt-free paradise. It would be a monetary collapse. Dollars would vanish from the global system as bonds were retired. International trade would seize up. Banks would struggle to meet obligations. Asset prices would implode. Civilization as we know it would not freeze instantly, but the gears would grind and keep grinding until something broke. So debt cannot simply be paid off. It is not a credit card balance you promise to clear by working overtime. It is the oxygen of the system, the water in which every transaction swims. Debt is liquidity. Debt is money. The national debt is not an ugly bug on the clean body of the economy. It is part of the nervous system itself. Calling for its elimination makes for a good slogan, but in practice, the system is built to prevent exactly that from happening. That brings us to the most personal question of all. If everyone owes everyone, and countries owe themselves, then who actually benefits? Who sits at the end of that one-way flow of interest? The biggest creditor of the United States is not China or some foreign enemy waiting to collect. It is the United States itself. Pension funds, mutual funds, insurance companies, and above all, the Federal Reserve and the financial institutions that cluster around it. They hold treasury bonds because those bonds are labeled risk-free. The government, in turn, pays hundreds of billions, moving toward $1 trillion, in interest every year. Not principal, just interest. Where does that money come from? It comes from taxes. From the money withheld before a paycheck hits a worker's bank account, from sales taxes built into every purchase, from corporate taxes passed on in the prices people pay for goods and services, from the invisible drain that takes a slice of productivity and routes it elsewhere. It is not called wealth extraction. It is not called upward redistribution. It is called debt service, a harmless phrase for the largest ongoing wealth transfer in human history. The recipients are not mysterious villains hidden in shadows. They have logos on skyscrapers and index funds in retirement accounts. BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, and their peers. They manage the world's retirement money and sit on top of giant piles of government bonds. When the United States pays interest, those payments flow through these institutions to their clients. On paper, that includes teachers, firefighters, engineers, and ordinary workers whose pensions depend on those returns. But the distribution is wildly uneven. Wealthier clients hold far more assets. The firms take their cut in fees. The top slices of the income distribution collect the fattest share of the interest, while the bottom slices shoulder a disproportionate share of the taxes and inflation that fund it. Here is the cruel symmetry. The world owes itself. The creditors and debtors are, in theory, the same species, the same societies, the same nations. But the interest always flows upward, from worker to owner, from consumer to creditor, from taxpayer to bondholder, from countries in crisis to banks that lent recklessly, from the many to the few. It is not a conspiracy. It is simply how the plumbing has been arranged. A lot of very smart people over 3 centuries built a system that channels value in one direction while appearing neutral and inevitable. Now ask why no major country truly escapes this. If Argentina defaults, the world survives. Its economy suffers. Its people pay the price. But the global system moves on. If Italy defaulted, the European Union would shake, maybe break. If Japan defaulted, the global bond market would shatter. But if the United States defaulted, the planet would, economically speaking, stop. Not because America is morally superior or divinely chosen, but because the entire global financial architecture is anchored to the dollar, to treasury bonds, to belief in the full faith and credit of the US government. So default, for the largest players, is treated as impossible. What actually happens is more subtle. They refinance. They roll over old debt into new debt. They restructure terms. They borrow more to pay interest on what they already owe. The numbers on the spreadsheet climb. The ceiling is raised. The can is kicked down the road. The show goes on. Default is avoided not because the debts are truly manageable, but because the system cannot survive without belief. Debt is not just money. Debt is trust. Trust that governments will keep honoring their obligations. Trust that taxpayers will keep working and paying. Trust that central banks will keep intervening to prevent collapse. Trust that institutions will never seriously question the architecture they depend on. Break that trust, and nothing stands. The markets do not simply correct. They panic. When trust cracked in 2008, Lehman Brothers failed, and the shock nearly brought down the entire global system. That was one bank. Imagine an entire major sovereign. This is what makes the machine both fragile and invincible at the same time. It is fragile because it depends on infinite growth in a finite world. Every year, more debt is needed to keep the system expanding. Every year, the future is pulled into the present. At some point, the math stops working. Yet it is invincible because no government can afford to stop borrowing. To slam the brakes on deficits is to slam the brakes on growth, to trigger recessions, to risk political chaos. Fragile because a major default could trigger global collapse. Invincible because the only alternative to moving forward seems to be instant destruction. The system lives in a kind of quantum state, stable and collapsing at the same time. To the average person, life goes on. Groceries get bought, bills get paid, markets fluctuate but do not vanish. The machine hums in the background. Yet, under the surface, every new crisis requires more intervention, more money creation, more creative accounting, more faith. Each rescue increases the scale of the next potential disaster. Each patch makes the underlying code more tangled. And its only real fuel is belief. Belief that central banks will always find a way. Belief that governments, no matter how divided, will always prioritize saving the system over any ideological fight. Belief that bonds described as risk-free will never, ever fail. Belief that somehow, somewhere, growth will return, productivity will surge, demographics will reverse, or technology will rescue the system from the weight of its own promises. For 300 years, this engine has powered the world. Permanent debt, globalized debt, effectively infinite debt, inescapable debt. Not because leaders are stupid, not because nations are simply irresponsible, but because the system would not survive if they stopped borrowing. Every election, every budget fight, every central bank announcement happens inside this architecture. Politicians argue about how to spend. They almost never question the structure that forces them to borrow in the first place. So the real question, the one that matters more than any headline, any election, any market chart, is not whether the next crisis will come. It will. The real question is how long a civilization can run on a financial engine built in the 1600s, refined in the 1800s, expanded in the 1900s, and stretched to its limit in the 21st century, before someone finally admits that the engine itself might need to be replaced. Maybe that replacement is gradual. Debt jubilees, alternative currencies, new ways of creating money not tied directly to permanent interest payments. Maybe it is chaotic. A wave of defaults, rapid inflation, a loss of faith that forces a reset nobody planned. Or maybe the system limps along for another century, patched and extended, wobbling but never quite falling. Nobody knows because there has never been a global debt structure like this in history. What is certain is this: the architects are gone. Paterson, Rothschild, Morgan, Volcker. They built a machine to solve the problems of their time, and it worked so well that it outlived them all. It now runs on autopilot, maintained by institutions that inherited it, defended by experts who benefit from it, and powered by billions of people who never agreed to it, but were born into it. At some point, someone will have to do more than adjust the dials. Someone will have to look at the engine itself and answer the question almost nobody in power wants to ask out loud. Is this the only way for a civilization to run its finances? Or is it simply the only way we remember?